I'm seeing a lot of conflict because of a lack of clear swim lanes with these shops because they don't have clear rules of engagement with how they're going to work together. You end up in a situation where they kind of fight each other for the business rather than working as a symbiotic single entity organization. And part of this is because they're managing their own P&Ls. So doing overflow work in a fixed capacity environment where your margins are constrained, maybe you're the best team. It's like not giving the guy who passes the ball all the credit and giving the guy who shoots the ball all the credit, right?
Yeah.
Like the guy who passes doesn't register any points on the board, but those assists are incredibly valuable. So if you're managing shops to their margins and their P&Ls, my inclination is to take as many shots as I can take rather than pass the ball when it makes the most sense to do so. And I think that's what happens when you align with individual success in a different way than the holistic entity success. So you are a strategic account executive at Paperless Parse. This is a fairly new role for us over the last 18 months. You've spent an enormous amount of time talking to private equity roll-ups, talking to shops that have gotten acquisitive and started buying other businesses. You've seen this first and foremost. And I thought it would be super helpful for all of our customers, also super helpful for the private equities out there looking to go into trying to put together a roll-up, for us to just have a conversation about what we're seeing in the market. Because I think the one takeaway I have is it's anything but easy. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely.
So talk to me about let's start at the beginning. We had this hypothesis at Paperless Parts since day one that we would see an enormous transition of ownership from 2020 to 2030. I think we're actually seeing that right now. I think we're seeing pretty significant amount of acquisitions, a pretty significant amount of passing to the next generation. What are you seeing out there?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Jason. A lot of what my role is now is working with our existing customers that are part of a multi-site organization. Like you said, in the low interest rate environment, there was a ton of acquisitions, and we realized at some point we had dozens of multi-site customers that are all dealing with the same challenges. And what we saw was really PE firms coming in and gobbling up five, six, seven, eight shops trying to drive synergies through acquisition. Uh, we saw folks coming in and really trying to expand into a key set of industries, a certain market, really expanding geographically to deepen the wallet share with some big OEMs.
This sounds like typical PE playbook, right? One plus one plus one equals six. That's the thesis, right? How have you actually seen it playing out with some of these shops? Like right to the punchline. Does this work? Is it great? Or are there a lot of landmines?
I think it's a lot harder than people think. I think a lot of shops come in and say, we're going to drive synergies on the back end. We're going to get everyone on the same ERP system. We're going to go and sell a lot more stuff to certain customers and we'll make money hand over fist. And 5, 6 years in, everyone is still on separate ERP systems. They've changed strategies two or three times. There are people who have changed roles and now all of a sudden you're starting from scratch again. A lot harder. I think the big one is obviously ERPs, but just how do you get everyone to not compete against each other? How do you navigate earnout clauses? How do you navigate change management? That's probably the biggest thing, right? I'm sure you've seen that quite a bit, Jason, from talking to leadership.
Yeah,
Um,
and the leadership turns over quite a bit. I think what we're seeing is there's a little bit of a different muscle for the go out, find them and buy them. That's like one CEO persona. And then there's another CEO persona of take all of them and integrate them and get them playing as a team. And then there's another CEO persona of now that they're integrated, let's go run it as a single organization. And so we end up seeing these leadership teams turn over one, two, sometimes three times before they hit their final resting place, if you will, as a single entity organization. And I think there's a chasm to cross there. A lot of times we don't see these shops make that pivot, as you said, right? That 5 years in, still trying to figure out, are we going to force everybody onto the same ERP system or not? And I think partly what I'm seeing is private equity has this fundamental assumption that if we go buy five $10 million shops for a 3x EBITDA ratio, right? Like I can buy for 3x the EBITDA. So I'm paying in a $10 million shop, let's say it's 2 million in EBITDA. That means I'm paying 6 million to buy that shop. I can take all five of those shops, put them together, and instead of a 3x, I'm going to see valuation expansion, right? So now it's not 3 times 2 million, it's 10 million of EBITDA across all five shops, and it's like a 6x. So immediately I've created something that is more valuable. That is I see that type of private equity math constantly coming into these small businesses. And I think people tend to overlook that buying a $10 million job shop manufacturing business is dramatically harder than other industries. Like, I think this is like, you get kicked right in the face. What's Mike Tyson's statement? Like, everybody's got a plan until you get punched in the face. That is arguably the most accurate statement for buying into job shops and contract manufacturers. It is just such a risky environment where the owner is really that linchpin. And so I think you've had this like really awesome purview on the market, and because you've gotten to see some that go really, really well, and you got to see some that are actually don't go so well. So what differentiates them? What goes well? What doesn't go well? Like, if I'm, we'll frame this up. If I'm a shop and I have multiple private equity companies looking to buy me, what should I be looking for? Like, how do I know which one's going to be successful and which one isn't?
Yeah, I've seen it from the perspective of the PE shops in retrospect, right? 2, 3 years later, what were the biggest challenges they faced? A lot of folks try to move too quickly, too fast, where you end up spooking both your employees that you just acquired and the customer who's now expecting quality to nosedive. I've heard of shops where they acquire a company, they change the name immediately, they close up that shop a year later because all their customers and employees left. That's like the day one problem that I hear a lot of folks thinking is we're better than the shop we acquired. We know the right way to do things. We have a brand that you guys are going to get rolled into. And obviously that's the long-term play is how do we drive synergies and how do we make 1 + 1 = 3 by building a multi-site brand. However, there's always these change management milestones you kind of have to hit in order to make that transition successful. Getting folks on the right team, not competing against each other, demonstrating trust to these new customers and your employees. Those are all things that take time, right? And I assume you've seen it, Jason, from your perspective as well. Seeing things go badly day one, it's all around change management.
Yeah, and it's such a hard thing when these businesses largely are run by brute force by really talented owners that they've effectively lived Colin Powell's philosophy of doing every job themselves. Mm-hmm. They've run every single machine on the floor. They've made every part. They've looked at every drawing. Now that doesn't scale, but because they have that tribal knowledge of everything the shop does, that owner is such a key linchpin. So let's structure this for folks. Let's start right here. I think what we're hitting on is the first and most important piece, which is retention of talent. So if we're coming out and you're coming to buy my shop and you're a private equity business, the first thing I'm wondering is, how do I make sure that, one, it's worth my time to stick around? Two, how do I make sure that I can incentivize all of my people to stick around? And what's gonna have a negative impact on that? And that's probably a little bit of overinvestment. Like, I think a lot of times a private equity thinks the synergies will happen immediately. and thus the cost basis will go down. And I think that's a false premise. I think the cost actually goes up because you're putting retention bonuses in place. You're investing in building a team. You're buying people swag. You're doing all the things that get everybody on the bus together. And I think the mistake that we see a lot of people make is they go and they try to just financially engineer it. So they'll put an earnout in place.
Yeah.
And tell people what's an earnout? What is that? Walk me through that.
Yeah, an earnout is tying financial outcomes to a shop owner or employee's bonus, right? So the company does well, you guys would do well. If you acquire a company that has a certain level of profit, maintaining that profit allows you to recoup the sale price, a portion of it in multiple years, year 2, year 3, et cetera.
Okay, so we have 1, retention, right? So we're going to put that as the bucket. 2, it sounds like what we're coming to is alignment, an alignment of structure and incentives. And it probably one hand washes the other here. So let's talk about earnouts for a second. I have seen the earnouts drive horrifically bad behavior because it's exactly what you said. It's, I'm going to come in and I'm going to buy your business and I'm going to give you 3 times EBITDA. So you have 2 million in EBITDA today. I'm going to buy your business for 6. But what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to give you 4 today. And I will either give you in 2 years another 1, 2, or 3 million. Now, if it goes really poorly, you get 1 million, or maybe you get nothing.
Yeah.
If it goes to plan, you get that 2 million. You retain the customers, you hit certain margins, blah, blah, blah. And if you do even better, you can hit that 3 million, maybe even 4 million additional, right? They try to sell this vision of the first bite at the apple is great, but the second bite at the apple could be even larger, right? There's a lot to like there on paper. But I think the concern is if the plan is to go and get all these companies playing as a single team, it becomes really, really tricky to have earnouts. Because now you have a situation, and you can structure earnouts well, but I would tie them to the overall success of the corporate entity and not to the success of the individual site entity. And that is really difficult if you do not have a holistic corporate strategy and you have individual site strategies. When you tie earnouts to individual sites, you're going to end up in a situation where each of these sites is playing for themselves. Let's use a basketball analogy. If I give every player on the court a bonus incentive if they score more than 20 points in a game, who's going to pass the ball? Right? Doesn't matter if we win or lose. Who's going to pass the ball? I get paid more if I sink 20. I got to take at least 25, 30 shots. Right? I'm not going to hand it off. I'm going to pull up and shoot rather than pass every time. And I fucking hate basketball. Like, just not, like, I don't even play the sport, but the analogy makes so much sense for this because they're putting incentives in place that drive individualism in the sites because they think that that is going to drive a behavior of keep working hard, retain the customers you have, do what we say. And what they really want is do what's best for the holistic entity. So you were talking about this in the beginning, different reasons people perform roll-ups. One of the things we've come here at Paperless Parts to say is people are trying to build a one-stop shop, right? Yeah. I want to be able to take advantage of diverse capabilities and capacity across a holistic organization. Talk a little bit about that. Like, we've seen some of these go pretty well. Yep. When you build out a one-stop shop, what's the recipe? What do you need?
Yeah, well, in any scenario, there's going to be change. You're acquiring 1, 2, 3, 4 sites. There's going to be strategies that you put in place where earnouts, if I'm a shop owner just got acquired, I wouldn't want to change anything because I'm looking for that 2 million in revenue, right? And so it makes it really hard when you, just to like finish that point, makes it really hard when you have earnouts in place at the P&L level for PE shops to enact those strategies. what we've seen, if you think about, let's say, 50 sites we've talked to, let's say five of them are letting the shops do individual set of brands. We look at this as a house of brands versus a one-stop shop. A house
Yep.
of brands, you're really trying to drive that operational efficiency. That's really hard to do. And so a lot of the folks we've seen are saying, hey, we are going to really deepen our wallet share in this particular customer, in this particular industry. We are going to figure out who is the best suited to do a particular process. That could be based on a certain location, that could be based on machines, that could be based on their expertise. And we're going to funnel work to the shop that has the best chance of winning that generate the most margin for us. So there's a lot of, at the very beginning, figuring out what shops can do the best type of work. There's a lot of data. It's not just what's my win rate, it's what's my turnaround time, what's my actuals, what are the experts at that shop that can allow us to hit difficult parts. Those are all things that really take a lot of time to figure out. And if you have shop owners that are trying to keep that close to the vest and say, oh, I've competed with the new shop that you just acquired, I'm not going to really share any of that bread and butter. That makes it really hard, right? So the first thing is really trying to make sure we understand what the end goal is, getting everyone on board. Now, swag is a good way to do that. The other way is structuring the right type of behavior, right? How are you going to incentivize shops for assists? How are you going to incentivize shops for the performance of the company? Those are what we've seen the really successful multi-site shops do.
I love it. I think you're hitting on a third piece here. So we've got first and foremost, talent is key in this space. People are incredibly hard to find, incredibly hard to recruit. And like it or not, there's so much tribal knowledge in the way a business is run, in the way parts are made, in the way customers are supported, in the way unique types of machines are run. You cannot afford to have significant turnover. So we have retention. You got to have a strategy for retention. And maybe these go in a different order, but you have to have a strategy for retention. It sounds like you need to have alignment in the way you go out and buy these shops, alignment of incentives. We do not want to incent behavior that does not create a strong alignment across your portfolio of companies, whatever that is. And the third is interesting. I think you just hit on it, but it's actually have and articulate a clear strategy. I think a lot of times these shops or these private equities sit a little bit on a fence where, to your point, are we going to be a house of brands where each brand operates independently and runs as a successful business, and there might be slight synergies that we can achieve in purchasing or slight dials we can turn on moving people to different sites or implementing the same tech stack at each site, but largely the companies operate separately? Or is this going to be a single branded house where it's going to be under one brand and each site is going to operate as effectively a satellite manufacturing site, but one single entity that is facing the customers? And there are probably elements that set businesses up for success under each of those house of brands, branded house. I think the one that comes back to me that's striking, and I'd be interested if you align with this as well, but I think it really comes back to the size of the acquisitions.
Yeah.
So many folks think they can go out there and buy sub 10 million in revenue businesses and kind of smash them all together and let them go like play as a branded house or straddle the fence. Like, yeah, you still quote your customers, but we're going to fire you a bunch of work from the primary entity that's doing BD and has a prettier website. And that just kind of ends up being this mess. Whereas I think you and I both seen organizations where they're buying much, much larger shops, the 20 million, the 50 million in revenue. And they're kind of pulling those shops together, but they're letting them stay somewhat autonomous. So what have you seen? Is that similar to what you're seeing out there?
Yeah, I think the more we talk to these shops and have partnerships with them, the more it ultimately comes back to it's really hard to say, the PE firm or as an expert in this industry, I'm going to go buy a bunch of shops, I'm going to keep them separate, and we're just going to put best in class processes to drive value. Ultimately, it becomes a how do we consolidate these shops into one brand? That
Yeah.
ultimately is what happens. Um, and so, I would say 5-10% of shops end up staying a house of brands.
Yep.
Usually it comes down to, hey, we're going to consolidate these businesses. We realize that that's the best way to do it. That's the best way to drive synergies. Um, because they get, like you said, it's really hard. If you have a shop that they're all standalone, but one shop leaves, a shop owner leaves, customers leave with them, the employees leave with them, all of a sudden you have a huge wreck on your hands. And so there's a lot of risk in this industry. So it ends up coming down to how are we going to build a brand that's bigger than this one particular one over time? Um, that way we can start getting everyone on similar, not necessarily ERPs, because that's a whole other conversation, but similar processes, similar or complementary services, working as one particular team here. That's really where a lot of these shops are seeing value.
Yeah, it sounds like you're hitting on a next element here. So we've got to retain the talent. The way you acquire these shops, we got to make sure that you're not disincentivizing the outcome, which means as a third, you've got to have a strategy for how you buy these businesses. I think that the next piece we've got to hit on here is timeline. People, I think you can create, investors can create a very unhealthy pressure to move at a pace that does not work for the businesses, given the complexity of operating the businesses. And thus, if I'm a private equity and I've gone out to my investors and I've said, we're going to buy all these shops in 18 months, then we're going to spend 3 years, we're going to smack them all together, and then we're going to turn around and in the next 6 months, so at the 5 year mark, we'll sell something that's for X value. That timeline is really tight.
Mhm.
It's a really difficult timeline. And it's a really difficult timeline, especially if you've never done it before in the space. So even if you've rolled up other types of businesses, these are really uniquely challenging. So I think that the next level here is not just have a strategy, but have a realistic timeline for how long it's going to take before these organizations are actually playing as a single team. Because I think what you said is like that's the end state, right? Is to get everybody under one umbrella, operating effectively as a team, sharing work, taking advantage of synergies. Maybe they have slightly different tech stacks because ripping the ERP systems out is too painful, but largely playing as a cohesive unit.
Mhm.
That's got to take years.
Yeah. And I think the big thing that we hear a lot of folks come into this, because I talk with a lot of folks that are just starting off on this PE journey. And 95% of them, their step one, their day one is let's get everyone on the same systems. We can't manage what we can't measure. So we're just going to go and buy a best in class multi-site ERP. And that'll be the hardest battle. That's what takes the 2 or 3 years. And then from there, we can really be one happy family. And that is really, really hard, even if you structure earnout clauses differently, because you have legacy databases, you have ERP systems that don't fit. It's not a one size fits all. Um, it's really expensive. And like you said, the change management aspect of this is probably the most difficult part of it all. And so,
Yeah, don't underinvest. Sounds like sounds
yeah,
like a bullet point here, right?
yeah, 100%. And so where a lot of folks come to this is we see this nearly every time. I think there's one shop we talked to that did this successfully, where they give up halfway through the ERP rollouts and just say, you know what? Rather than get everyone on one ERP, we're going to get a system that connects with the various ERPs. We're going to get a minimum viable ERP list that you either have to be one on these five. And if you're on one of these five, great. We'll
Don't
figure.
buy a shop that's not.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just a mistake.
Yep. Yep. And so what folks end up doing, and we can go to their next, maybe we can dive in deeper, but what a lot of shops end up doing is just building systems on top of these various ERP systems. There's a lot of software out there, paperless parts, cough, cough, that can integrate on top of whatever ERP you have. And that's where we've seen a lot of success is folks are going to say, hey, we're going to build in a CRM. Doesn't matter what ERP you have, we're going to get the data we need to from the CRM. Doesn't matter what quoting tool you have. We're going to provide one quote back to the customer using paperless parts. Doesn't matter what ERP you have on the back end for reporting and accounting. There's other systems out there that can consolidate data from various ERPs. So rather than spend the time to drive synergies by having everyone on one system, let's just build a way to grab data from all sorts of various systems that can basically be plug and play.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's kind of like expecting someone to be able to do something they've never been able to do before in an even higher pressure environment. So, like the narrative I've seen come to life quite a bit is buy the shop, everybody celebrates. Yeah, acquisition, new owner, look, it's awesome. Okay, now you've got an earnout. So you better keep this shop running, something that you've been doing, but largely probably spending 80 hours a week doing. You got to keep the shop running for the next 2 years, and you cannot have your margins compress, and you cannot have your revenue decline. Then coming in and saying, oh, and by the way, we want you to do something you've never been able to do before, which is completely rip out your ERP system and adopt a new one, right? Like if these shops were super skilled at adopting new software all the time, maybe, but how often are shops ripping out and implementing new technology? I mean, this is one of the reasons we've invested so heavily in having a support and implementation team at Paperless, because the reality is we know we're going to have to handhold it. And I think the only one of these that I've actually seen go really well, these private equity roll-ups, where they are switching the ERP system, is when the private equity team puts a team on site for multiple months to handhold the transition. And they remove the risk of, oh, you're going to miss this earnout.
Yeah.
And that aligns the whole team. They set the incentive around, you're going to get on our ERP system in 3 months. And oh, by the way, we're going to put these two people on site with you to migrate the data, to train your team. And we're not going to leave until the operation is running smoothly. You kind of can't have both.
Yeah.
And that's where I think this bullet point of you can't underinvest really comes to play. Like I think there's so much pressure in these private equity organizations to be able to show the synergies from acquisition. And then all of a sudden you get hit with a, $800,000 quote from Infor or Epicor to go out and try to put all these sites on the same ERP. Then you end up having them make mistakes and deliver parts late, and you see the revenue drop a little bit from pissed off customers while you're trying to roll out this new ERP system. And now at the end of that first year, after you've made all the acquisitions, you're going back out to these investors and you're saying, well, actually, all the entities were doing 10 million a year. So they, 5 shops doing 10 million, 50 million. But this year we actually did 42, and the margins are a little bit worse.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden now that's hyper, pressure cooker. And the inclination is to go pivot. Screw it. Forget the ERP. We're not doing it. Get everybody back up to producing. We can't afford to have this dip.
Yep.
Got to understand that the dip is going to be natural. There will be attrition. People are going to leave. So the dip is going to be natural, and the investment up front is going to be significant. And I think that they undercapitalize a lot of these acquisitions. The premise that a shop can do two things, which is completely change their operating system and continue to deliver at the same level they've been delivering at in previous years, that is kind of a false premise.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's why people opt for not doing ERP and opt for using paperless parts because the implementation is much less of a ripping out the central nervous system and a lot more of putting a supercharger on that existing system in an effective way that allows these multi-site organizations to collaborate cross-site without having to disrupt the flow.
Yeah. And I think that's where PE firms have learned their lesson over the last few years. I think maybe it was part of the low interest rate. I said this a little bit in the beginning, part of the low interest rate environment where folks were buying up any sort of shop. And there was this huge spree of we're just going to get everybody, we're going to rip them out. We're a little bit of just we'll figure this out later. Now I think a lot of shops are being, or a lot of PE firms are being way more strategic on who they're acquiring. They're not only looking at, is this culture fit with what we're trying to build, but they're also thinking about is, do they have an ERP system that plays nicely with our strategy? That's a big plus. I've actually seen folks that are opting for no ERP system versus an ERP system that doesn't work for their goals, right?
Yeah.
Which I thought was pretty interesting. Uh, they're also really trying to set up the way they raise money to have a longer term view because 3 to 5 years does not work in this space. Um,
Like I wish it did.
yeah,
It's just, it's too tricky. It's very much the Indiana Jones and the golden statue problem, right? Like you got to get that transition really perfect or the whole room collapses around you.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So it's tough, right? I think there's things that our multi-site customers have done really well. Um, I'd be curious, Jason, if you acquired and maybe got inherited 5 shops day one, uh, what would you do, right? What are the things you would do to set this up successfully?
So let's go back through our list. So the very first thing I would do is identify key talent. So in every single shop, I would try to figure out exactly who needs to be on the bus, not how, but who. So who are the key players to get involved? Then what I would do is I would figure out creating some kind of an option pool that allows those folks to participate in the exit of that shop. And I think, I mean, we do this here at Paperless Parts, where all employees have stock in the business and have the option to participate in that success of the business. I think that top level alignment is crucial. We've seen these go really well when they're converted into an ESOP. I don't know that that's the right approach from a private equity perspective, but that alignment across all the employees to participate at the top level when the organization does well is critical. So I would figure out who are the key pieces of talent. I would put the right retention plans in place for those folks that are not so much aligned with the site success, but that are aligned with the holistic organization's success. Then what I would do is I would come in and I would make sure that the way we've structured those acquisitions facilitates team play. So not just going to incentivize each site for being really successful. I'm going to incentivize the team winning as a whole. So we've got a whole group of people that we're going to retain. Now we have those folks that are incentivized to be really successful. Then I think the next step is articulating to the entire organization what success looks like, right? So we have these groups, we've brought them in, we've identified the key people, we've got alignment, they are incentivized to stick around, be successful. But the problem is a lot of times organizations don't give them something to shoot at. It's like, so how do we define success? Is it a top line revenue number? Is it a holistic margin across all of the sites? I think that's one of the reasons that there's this push to drive towards a single ERP system. It's simply getting the data in a format that you need it in to understand if the holistic entity is winning or not. Mm-hmm. That can be really tricky. But at the end of the day, I think it makes sense to either not switch the ERP systems, and if they're deeply ingrained in their ERP, and find a way to harvest that data on the back end And I would not under-resource that. I would put good people in place to pull the data that we need to understand if the organization is winning as a whole and communicate that back down to the sites. Because I think I would expect to see if the sites are playing well as a team, I would expect to see sites taking on some work that is lower margin as they're doing cross collaboration. It'd just be natural. And I
Yeah.
would have clear rules of the road for how that collaboration is going to take place. So you don't end up with one site fighting the other site for pennies of margin.
Mhm.
It's completely irrational. Does not make any sense. But if
Yeah.
I'm held to my site P&L and you're held to your site P&L and you need laser cut parts from me because you don't have a laser cutter, who takes the margin? Those rules of the road, I would get that core group of employees together. I would give them the clear target to shoot at. Today we're doing 50 million in revenue across 5 sites. In the next 3 years, we want to get to 100 million in revenue across the sites.
Yeah.
So that's the goal. Here's how we're going to do it. We got these investments to make, and here's how we're going to measure it so that everybody understands whether we're winning or we're losing, and you're not penalized for playing as a team.
Yep.
Right. So now you're starting to build this as a single entity that's geared around the success of the entity. And then I would be very careful about what I change in the early years. I think you try to watch it and you try to layer in systems that are accretive, not detractive, not subtractive from the overall success and efficiency of the organization. So ripping out the ERP system, that's a 12-month to 18-month timeline. It just is before you're back up to operating at full speed. You're not going to see the benefit for 12 to 18 months. So I would look to, like you said, I would try to layer in either a holistic CRM system. I would look to put paperless parts in because then I'm going to unify all the quoting, all the collaboration, make sure the shops aren't competing against each other unnecessarily, make sure that they have rules of the road for how they're going to pass work back and forth between them. And then I would focus on getting the accounting into a single view where everyone can see why are we winning, why are we losing, and they can be bonused or incentivized based on the holistic organization winning. If one
Yeah.
site crushes it, everybody should feel like they're winning.
Yep. No, that's awesome, Jason. I think the one thing you mentioned too around shops not competing against each other, that is where day one I would focus. We hear a lot of folks saying, well, you guys are under the same umbrella. Why did I get a price that was wildly different from your organization? And obviously, there's reasons for that. But what a lot of shops are doing from a sales perspective is really just trying to make sure day one, it's going to be really hard to figure out who does a job the best. So a lot of these shops are doing is they're trying to centralize the sales team. One, I could have a better relationship than another person in my organization with Boeing, with John Deere. And so let's leverage that relationship. And to get quotes and get activity through the door. And then on the back end, let's figure out who can make it. Maybe day one, I'm going to send that same quote to 5 or 6 different shops. I'm going to figure out where does everyone come out from a lead time, from a pricing perspective. And then before we send it back to the customer, I'm going to make sure that I'm picking which site is sending the quote out. I'm not sending multiple quotes to the same customer from my business.
It's always so funny when we see the sites fetter out the work to the other site, and then the buyer gets back 5 different quotes on the same RFQ. And the buyer's like, what? Like, how do I keep this organized? Like,
Yeah.
you're not all in my site as approved vendors. Do we have NDAs with each of you? Like it's trying to run before you've actually caught the ball.
Right.
Yeah. I
Right.
think that's really that's sage advice. This idea of competing against each other, it's actually like a quite simple problem to solve. And it just comes to centralizing an estimating process where you have visibility over RFQs. 2 sites get the same request. Again, rules of the road. How are you going to manage this? What is the rule? How do we work together on it? How do we make sure that the entity as a whole wins?
Yeah.
Um, that's I think that's what makes this so hard. The
Yeah,
product,
because
the
Yeah,
math.
'cause if I'm getting something from Boeing, maybe my internal number is different. Maybe the way I quote is different. So sales leaders just ripping their head out trying to figure out, are we quoting the same thing? How much, and spending a lot of time making sure they're not doing that. That's why people usually come in and say, we're going to put in a CRM. We're going to have ways of standardizing the naming convention. Usually shops look at, let's just keep everything the way they emailed it to us. Let's not change anything, or let's have another field for internal numbers, because then you get into the ERP translation. Um, but that creates extra work, right? The problem then is now sales guys or estimators have to go in and put something in their CRM. If they can't quote out of the CRM, so they got to go and do something else in another system.
Yeah.
That's where we've seen a lot of success.
And you're expecting that shop to then continue operating at the same velocity with having so much more data entry and so much more work.
Yeah.
I think if I'm a shop owner and I'm sitting on the other side of the table and private equities are approaching me, I'm probably going to ask those questions, which is, okay, well, what's the structure? How are we going to make sure that we retain all of our best people and incentivize them to do well? How are we going to make sure that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts at the end of the day? What's the timeline for doing that? I'm going to go through and I'm going to ask those questions, because that initial earnout of, oh man, I get 4 today, I could get 4 tomorrow. I think that can tease some people into making bad decisions, not having a really well articulated strategy. I also think that some of these private equity buyers see these really nice EBITDA producing businesses, and they just think, oh, I'm gonna buy a bunch of these cash cows. We'll turn the knobs a little bit. We'll make them that much more successful, and we'll end up selling this business in 5 years for a really nice return to our investors.
Yeah.
That sounds so good on paper. It really does. But gosh, it seems like it's probably, from what we've seen, it's so much harder than that.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. The other thing around value and brand is, how do you do that slowly? I said this a little bit at the beginning, is keep both names for a while. Create a brand that works for the long-term play. It's Johnson and Johnson. And as you start acquiring shops, keep the brand name, the historical brand name, Twinkies or whatever, Huggies, and start adding a Johnson and Johnson company behind that. And so ultimately, folks start appreciating the two brands that are combining. Then after we've seen shops after 3-4 years, then they'll start converting to a Johnson and Johnson company after you've built the familiarity and the trust over time.
I think that is really sage advice. Go slow, have a strategy. Don't need to rip the Band-Aid off right away. Drive that alignment. Anything else? Any last thoughts for folks?
Uh, no, I think the last thing is really around people. A lot of these shops have developed key stakeholders that can funnel work or that know the businesses inside and out. And this is maybe after a few years. We typically see this air traffic controller as part of an estimating team or as part of an estimating process that can funnel the work to the right shop. Because that's another thing too. It's like sales leaders don't necessarily have a pulse on which shop can produce parts the most efficiently. So we typically see folks that are getting pulled up from one of the sites, one of the key estimators, an engineer, and they're really the ones who are navigating the estimating process. Now, that's where somebody like Paperless Parts, where we've seen it, is they're the ones funneling it to the right shop, building the processes, collaborating with the different sites, sending the quote back to sales that ultimately go back to the customer. I'm sure you've any thoughts there around how that process works?
You make such a good point. It keeps coming back to why I think these shops, these private equities, these teams try to go in and rip out the ERPs, because so much of this thesis of buy them, put them together, scale them, comes back to the ability to cross-functionally work. And how many shops have you worked with that have scheduling nailed in the ERP system today?
0.
Yeah, none of them. It's incredible. Everybody hates their ERP. Everybody hates scheduling. It's a very difficult problem. So now if I'm going to try to be an air traffic controller that sits over all these shops, my initial inclination is like, I want the same system in all the shops so I can look and see they've got capacity over here, or they've got this capability over here. How many times have you seen work centers in shops named something that makes absolutely no sense?
Well, actually, the way that people solve it is forget what's in the ERP system. If I'm going to quote to a single rate. I'm going to quote to a very generic work center, and then I'm going to go and fine tune it when I win the job.
That's, I think what you're saying there is so important, because to think that this can be done without humans in the loop is false promise.
Yeah.
It really is. You're better off having conductor sit over top of all of it, that has an estimator at every site that can pulse the organization to see where's the shop floor, where do we have capacity, what are we working on, and can manage that process closely rather than trying to rip out the system. I would probably do it with people until we had better systems in place. And I
Yeah.
don't know that such a system exists today for managing the shop across multiple sites. We've seen Infor Sightline work fairly well across a lot of these enterprise multi-site accounts, but getting it rolled out is a completely different prospect.
Yeah. And I would say that the day one or the trade-off, if you know data is not going to be perfect and you have a back-end way of manipulating it, is keep it generic, is quote to the highest rate. If you win the
Yeah.
job, great, you can send it out. It's just like buying material, right? You're going to go get an expensive quote. When you win the job, you'll go find it cheaper. Same concept. That allows you to do a few things. One is not have to worry so much about who's going to win the job at what margin. The other thing that you mentioned that's pretty important for shops is capacity sharing, and also expertise and estimator sharing. If you have the same generic way of costing, it's better, it's easier to start sharing estimators, to start making it more flexible on who's going to get this part ultimately when you win it.
That's such a good point. I think we could put a pin in it right here. I really think, just to echo your last point here, you cannot quote to a specific site if you are planning on choosing what site is going to run those parts. Because if the rates are not consistent across each one of those sites, you can end up in a position where you are going to end up producing those parts at a loss.
Mm-hmm.
That is going to hurt the individual site. It's going to hurt their P&L. It's going to make the people at that site disincentivized because their earnouts are tied to something else. I think you make a really incredible point there, and it aligns with have a strategy. So we talked about a bunch of really powerful things here. I think we should probably do a follow on here. And maybe what we'll do is we'll call in Alex Renner on our team. He's implemented several of these multi sites, and we'll have a chat with him. And we'll just talk about in the weeds, actually making all of what we talked about come to life.
Yeah.
Awesome. Good stuff. Thanks,
Yeah.
man.